Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fine podcast. I think it was earlier this year I mentioned that I would read through the Wall Street trilogy and then wrap up Sutton with The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. And the reason why I think this book is important is that Sutton demonstrates that throughout the Cold War, this was written before the end of the Cold War and the outcome was still in doubt, that Wall Street and business interests were still propping up the Soviets militarily even then. So it didn't stop with Lenin. It didn't stop with Stalin's confiscation in the 30s. It continued right up until the end of the Cold War. Of course, this book is published in the 80s. The Cold War is not yet over, but nonetheless, it is illustrative of this point, and I think is therefore worth reading. All right, so here we go. The Best Enemy Money Can Buy, forward by Gary North, dedicated to the memory of those who died in Korea and Vietnam, victims of our technology and greed. The business of lending blood money is one of the most sordid, cold-blooded, and criminal that was ever carried on to any considerable extent amongst human beings. It is like lending money to slave traders or to common robbers and pirates to be repaid out of their plunder. And the man who loans money to governments so-called for the purpose of enabling the latter to rob, enslave, and murder their people are among the greatest villains that the world has ever seen. Sanders Spooner, No Treason, 1870. This work was created with permission of Antony Sutton. Okay, I'm just skipping ahead. Forward by Dr. Gary North. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union launched a lightning-fast military offensive against the backward nation of Afghanistan. It was after this invasion that President Jimmy Carter admitted publicly that it had taught him more about the intentions of the Soviets than anything he had ever learned. Never again would he kiss the cheeks of Premier Brezhnev before the television cameras of the West. The Democrat-controlled Senate even refused to ratify his SALT II treaty. By the way, Ronald Reagan has been honoring its terms unofficially, and he has ordered the destruction of several Poseidon submarines, including the USS Sam Rayburn, the dismantling of which began in November of 1985, and which cost a staggering $21 million for the destruction of that one ship. The Nathan Hale and the Andrew Jackson are scheduled for destruction in 1986. To comply with SALT II, we will have to destroy an additional 2,500 Poseidon submarine warheads. Good faith American diplomatic officials argue, good grief, you may be thinking. The invasion of Afghanistan was a landmark shift in Soviet military tactics, departing from half a century of slow, plotting, smothering the enemy with raw power, tactics the Soviets military had adopted the lightning strike. Overnight, the Soviets had captured the Kabul airfield and surrounded the capital city with tanks. Tanks in an overnight invasion. How did a 30-ton Soviet tank roll from the Soviet border to the interior city of Kabul in one day? What about the rugged Afghan terrain? The answer is that there are two highways from the Soviet Union to Kabul, including one which is 647 miles long. The bridges can support tanks. Do you think that Afghan peasants built these roads for yak-drawn carts? Do you think that Afghan peasants built these roads at all? No, you built them. In 1966, reports on this huge construction project began to appear in obscure U.S. magazines. The project was completed the following year. It was part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. The Soviet and U.S. engineers worked side by side, spending U.S. foreign aid and money and Soviet money to get the highway built. One strip of road, 67 miles long, north through the Salong Pass to the USSR, cost $42 million, or $640,000 per mile. John W. Millers, the leader of the Union National Survey team in Afghanistan, commented at the time that it was the most expensive bit of road he had ever seen. The Soviets trained and used 8,000 Afghans to build it. If there were any justice in the world of international foreign aid, the Soviet tanks should have ruled by signs that read U.S. highways, tax dollars at work. Nice guys, the Soviets. They just wanted to help technologically backward nation. Nice guys, Americans, foreign aid officials. They also just wanted to help a technically backward nation, the Soviet Union. 7 decades of deals. The story you are about to read is true. The names have not been changed so as not to protect the guilty. In the mid-1970s, the original version of this book led to the destruction of Antony Sutton's career as a salaried academic researcher with the prestigious and therefore not quite ideologically tough enough Hoover Institute on War, Revolution, and Peace. That was a high price for Sutton to pay, but not so nearly high as the price you and I are going to be asked to pay because of the activities that the book describes in painstaking detail. Lenin is supposed to have made the following observation. If we were to announce today that we intend to hang all capitalists tomorrow, they would trip over each other trying to sell us the rope. I don't think he ever said that. However, someone who really understood Lenin, communism, and capitalist ethics said it. This book shows how accurate an observation it is. Antony Sutton is not about to offer the following evidence in his own academic self-defense, so I will. Perhaps the best informed American scholar in the field of Soviet history and overall strategy is Professor Richard Pipes of Harvard University. In 1984, his chilling book appeared, Survival is Not Enough, Soviet Realities and American Future, Simon & Schuster. His book tells us at last parts of the history of the Soviet Union's reliance on Western technology, including the infamous Kama River truck plant, which was built by the Pullman Swindle Company of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a subsidiary of M.W. Kellogg Co. Professor Pipes remarks that the bulk of Soviet merchant marine, the largest in the world, was built in foreign shipyards. He even tells the story, related in greater detail in this book, of the Bryant Chucking Grinder Company in Springfield, Vermont, which sold the Soviet Union the ball-bearing machines that alone made possible the targeting mechanisms of Soviet MIRV ballistic missiles. And in footnote 29 on page 290, he reveals the following. In his 3-volume detailed account of Soviet purchases of Western equipment and technology, Antony Sutton comes to conclusions that are uncomfortable for many businessmen and economists. For this reason, his work tends to either be dismissed out of hand as extreme or more often simply ignored. Professor Pipes knows how the academic game is played. The game cost Sutton his academic career, but the academic game is a very small potatoes compared to the historic game of world conquest by the Soviet Empire. We are dealing with a messianic state which intends to impose its will on every nation on earth, a goal which Soviet leaders have repeated constantly since they captured Russia and the nearly bloodless coup in October of 1917. Sutton identifies the deaf, mute, blind men who sell the Soviets the equipment they need for world conquest. But at least these deaf, mute, blind men get something out of it, money, not soft currency, Soviet rubles either. They get U.S. dollars from the Soviets, who in turn get long-term loans that are guaranteed by U.S. taxpayers. Their motivation is fairly easy to understand, but what do the academic drones get out of it? What do they get out for their systematic suppression of the historical facts and their callous treatment in book reviews of works such as Sutton's monumental 3-volume set, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development? What was in it, for example, for C.H. Feinstein of Clare College, Cambridge University, who reviewed Sutton's first volume covering 1917 and 1930? He could not honestly fault Sutton's basic scholarship, nor did he try. He has examined a vast amount of information, much of it previously unknown to scholars, regarding the trading contracts between the USSR and the West, notably Germany and the United States. The primary sources were the fascinating and extraordinary detailed files of the U.S. State Department and the archives of the German Foreign Ministry, and those who were supplanted by a wide-ranging and multilingual selection of books and journals. He even wrote that Sutton's prodigious researches, and this is apparently only the first of the 3 projected volumes, have provided students of Soviet economic development with a detailed survey of the way in which Western technology was transferred to the Soviet Union, and for this we are indebted to him. But having admitted this, thereby preserving the surface appearance of professional integrity, Feinstein then lowers the academic boon. Unfortunately, his attempt to go beyond this and to assert the significance of this transfer and of the concessions policy is unsatisfactory and overstates the extent and impact of the concessions as well as their importance for Soviet economic development. The defects of Sutton's approach, a similar lack of understanding, Sutton exaggerates, he further indulges his fondness for exaggeration. You get the basic thrust of the review. Facts are fine, we're all scholars here. But even the mildest sort of first-stage conclusions concerning the importance and significance of such facts are anathema. For the facts show that the Soviet economy should have this sign made over it, made in the West. Sutton's subsequent 2 volumes were never reviewed in this specialized academic journal, the journal above all other U.S. scholarly journals, in which it would have been most appropriate to include views of scholarly books on Soviet economic history. The information blackout had begun, and it was augmented by the publisher's own blackout beginning in 1973, a blackout discussed in this book. Less than 3 years after Feinstein's review was published, Bryant Chucking Grinder Co. sold the Soviets the ball-bearing grinders that subsequently placed the West at the mercy of the Soviet tyrants. At last, they possessed the technology which made possible a relatively low-risk first strike by Soviet missiles against our missiles and defenses. Until Bryant supplied the technology, the Soviets couldn't build such offensive weapons, which is why they had lobbied from 1961 until 1962 to get the U.S. government's authorization to buy the units. Within a few years after delivery, they had the missiles installed. Then they invaded Afghanistan. So much for Sutton's exaggerations. This book is not really designed to be read word for word. It is rather a kind of lawyer's brief filled with facts that none of us will remember in detail. But if the facts were not included, the book's thesis would be too far-fetched to accept. He therefore includes pages and pages of dull, dreary details that lead to an inescapable conclusion, that the West has been betrayed by its major corporate leaders with full compliance of its national political leaders. From this time forward, you can say in confidence to anyone, the United States financed the economic and military development of the Soviet Union. Without this aid financed by U.S. taxpayers, there would be no significant Soviet military threat, for there would be no Soviet economy to support the Soviet military machine, let alone sophisticated military equipment. Should your listener scoff, you need only hand him a copy of this book. It will stuff his mouth with footnotes. It will probably not change the scoffer's mind, however. Minds are seldom trained with facts. Certainly not college-trained minds. Facts do not change Professor Feinstein's mind, after all. The book will only shut up the scoffer when in your presence. But even then, it is worth a lot these days. From this day forward, you should never take seriously any State Department official, and certainly not the Secretary of State, who announces to the press that the nation is now and has always been engaged in a worldwide struggle against communism and Soviet aggression. Once in a while, secretaries of state feel pressured to give such speeches. They are nonsense. They are puffery for the folks out in Middle America. You may note for future reference my observation that Secretary of Commerce never feel this pressure to make anti-communist speeches. They, unlike secretaries of state, speak directly for American corporate interests. They know where their bread is buttered, and more important, who controls the knife. When it comes to trading with the enemy, multinational corporate leaders act in terms of the political philosophy of the legendary George Washington Plunkett of Tammany Hall. I see my opportunities and I took them. Plunkett was definitely on his graft. Our modern grafters have raised the stakes considerably. They are talking about bipartisan treason. Author's preface. Back in 1973, the author published National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union, itself a sequel to a 3-volume academic study, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, published by the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. These 4 books are detailed, verifiable catalogs of Western technology used and in use by the Soviet Union, acquired by gift, purchase, illegal diversion, or theft. Taken together, these 4 volumes constitute an extraordinary commentary on a basic weakness in the Soviet system and an equally extraordinary weakness in Western policymaking. The Soviets are heavily dependent on Western technology and innovation, not only in their civilian industries, but also in their military programs. Technology is, of course, the lifeblood of modern economic development. Technology is the difference between the Third World and the advanced 21st century development epitomized by Silicon Valley and California. Regrettably, most economists are not qualified to explore the role of technology in economic development. Technology is assumed as a given, whereas it is in fact a dynamic factor, the most dynamic factor, many would argue, in modern economic development. Similarly, State Department planners, essentially political scientists, are not at home with technology sufficiently so that in 1963, State issued papers to the effect that the Soviets had only self-generated technology. Even today, State and Commerce appear barely conversant with the extent of Soviet reverse engineering. Fortunately, development of defense is more attuned to technology, and among all government departments is alone aware of the magnitude of the problem described in The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. The deaf-mute blind men, to quote from Lenin, are the multinational businessmen who see no further than the bottom line of their current contract. Unfortunately, those internationalist operators have disproportionate influence in Washington. Consequently, arguments based on the flimsiest of evidence and the most absurd logic that fly in the face of all we know about the Soviets are able not only to be heard in Washington, but even form the basis of our policy. An inevitable conclusion from the evidence in this book is that we have totally ignored a policy that would enable us to neutralize Soviet global ambitions while simultaneously reducing the defense budget and the tax load on American citizens. Whether we like it or not, technology is a political tool in today's world. And if we want to survive in the face of Soviet ambitions, we will have to use this weapon sooner or later. At the moment, the combined efforts of the deaf, mute, blind men have been successful. Only an informed, aroused electorate has sufficient potential power to counter their suicidal ambitions. Chapter 1, America's Deaf, Mute, Blind Men. To attribute to others the identical sentiments that guide oneself is never to understand others. Gustave Le Bon. Over the last Over the past several decades, quietly, without media attention, many Americans in diverse fields of activity have been pressured into silence, and failing science have been moved from their position or excommunicated from a chosen profession. These men range from historians in Department of State, top-level officials in Department of Commerce, engineers working for IBM, to academics in America's leading universities. In each case, threats and pressures which led to censorship, firing, and excommunication track back to the deaf, mute, blind men and their associates in political Washington. Who are the deaf, mute, blind men? The Russian revolutionary Vladimir Ilyich Lenin coined the phrase. Whenever we think of Lenin's revolutionary philosophy, we cannot deny his genius in the analysis of capitalists and their motivations. Here is Lenin on the deaf, mute, blind men. The capitalists of the world and their governments in pursuit of conquest of the Soviet market will close their eyes to the indicated higher reality and thus will turn into deaf, mute, blind men. They will extend credits which will strengthen for us the Communist Party in their countries and give us the materials and technology we lack. They will restore our military industrially, indispensable for a future victorious attack on our suppliers. In other words, they will labor for the preparation of their own suicide. The suppressed higher reality. What is the higher reality that Lenin identifies? It is simply that the Soviet system cannot generate sufficient innovation and technology to become a world power. Yet Soviet global ambition demanded that its socialist system challenge and surpass the capitalist systems of the West. Lenin deduced just before he died in 1923 that Soviet communism had an Achilles heel, a fatal defect. In a remarkable about-face, Lenin then introduced a new economic policy, a return to limited free enterprise and a prelude to a long-lasting cooperation with Western capitalists, the deaf, mute, blind men. This policy was repeated by communist China in the early 1980s. It is the knowledge of this higher reality that has become ruthlessly suppressed by successive administrations under political pressure from international businessmen. The State Department, for example, has a disgraceful record of attempting to black out information and present a false picture of historical events. Under John Foster Dulles, Dr. G. Bernard Noble, a Rhodes Scholar and an enemy of any attempt to change the establishment's party line, was prompted to take charge of the historical office at the State Department. Two historians, Dr. Donald Dozer and Dr. Brighton Barron, who protested the official policy of distorting information and suppressing historical documents, were railroaded out of the State Department. Dr. Barron, in his book Inside the State Department, specifically charged the State Department with responsibility for the exportation of military technology to the Soviet Union, and listed 4 examples of highly strategic tools whose export to the USSR was urged by officials of the State Department. 1. Boring mills for manufacture of tanks, artillery, aircraft, and the atomic reactors used in submarines. 2. Vertical boring mills for manufacture of jet engines. 3. Dynamic balance machines used to balance shafts on engines for jet airplanes and guided missiles. 4. External cylindrical grinding machines, which a Defense Department expert testified were essential in making engine parts, guided missiles, and radar. Brighton Barron concludes, it should be evident that we cannot trust the present personnel of the department to apply our agreements in the nation's interests any more than we can trust it to give us the full facts about our treaties and other international commitments. Breathtakingly inaccurate are the only words that can describe the State Department's claim regarding our military assistance to the Soviet Union. The general State Department line is that the Soviets have a self-developed technology, that trade is always peaceful, that we have controls on the exports of strategic goods, and that there is no conceivable relationship between our exports to the Soviet Union and Soviet armaments production. An example will make this point. Here is a statement by Ambassador Treacy to the Senate. Ambassador Treacy, we, I think, are sometimes guilty, Senator, of a degree of false and unwarranted pride in our industrial and technological might. Kind of arrogance, if you will. We are ahead of the Soviet Union in many areas of industry and technology. But a nation that can accomplish the science and technological feats the Soviet Union has accomplished in recent years is clearly not a primitive mud hut economy. It is a big, rigorous, strong, and highly capable national entity. And its performance in the space field and in other fields has given us every indication that Soviet engineers, technicians, scientists are on the forefront of scientists, engineers, technicians of the world. Senator Muskie. So that the urge towards increased trade with Eastern European countries has not resulted in the weakening of restrictions related to strategic goods. Ambassador Treacy, I think that is an accurate statement, Senator. Now we think, quite an effective system of handling items which are in the military area are so closely related thereto that they become strategic by anyone's agreement. In fact, at the very time Terezis was making the above soothing statement, critical shipments of strategic materials and equipment were going forward to the Soviet Union. The so-called export controls law were a leaky sieve due to outright inefficiency in the departments of state and commerce. Censorship has enabled politically appointed officials in the permanent Washington bureaucracy to make such unbelievably inaccurate statements without fear or challenge in Congress or by the American public. The State Department files are crammed with information concerning U.S. technical and economic assistance to the Soviet Union. The author of this book required 3 substantial volumes, see bibliography, just to summarize this assistance for the years 1917 to 1970. Yet, former Secretary of State Dean Rusk, presumably acting on advice of the State Department, researchers stated in 1961, it would seem clear that the Soviet Union derives only the most marginal help in its economic development from the amount of U.S. goods it receives, a statement flatly contradicted by the massive evidence available in department files. In 1968, Nicholas D. Katzenbach, Assistant Secretary of State, made a statement that was similarly inconsistent with the observable fact and displayed a fundamental lack of common reasoning. We should have no illusions. If we do not sell peaceful goods to the nations of Eastern Europe, others will. If we erect barriers to trade with Eastern Europe, we will lose the trade and Eastern Europe will buy elsewhere. But we will not make it any easier our task of stopping aggression in Vietnam, nor in building security for the United States. In fact, aggression in South Vietnam would have been impossible without U.S. assistance to the Soviet Union. Much of the key European technology cited derives from U.S. subsidiaries. Jack N. Burnham, former Deputy Assistant of International Affairs of the Department of Commerce, repeated the same theme on behalf of the Commerce Department. This is the old problem of economic dependency. However, I do not believe that Russia would in fact permit herself to become dependent upon imported sources of strategic goods. Rather, she would import amounts additional to her strategic needs, thereby relieving the pressure on her economy by not risking dependence. In fact, Jack Burnham, to the contrary, notwithstanding, Soviet Russia is the most dependent large nation in modern history for wheat as well as technology. Here's another statement from former Secretary of Commerce Maurice H. Stans. Question: is there danger of this country's helping the Russians build war potential that might be turned against the interests of the free world? Answer: under the circumstances, we might be very foolish not to accept business which could create jobs in the United States. When refusing to sell to the Soviet Union, we would in no way deter their progress. Suppression of information. Information suppression concerning Soviet relations with the United States may be found in all administrations, Democrat and Republican, from Wilson to President Ronald Reagan. For example, on November the 28th, 1917, just a few weeks after the Petrograd and Moscow Bolsheviks had overthrown the democratic and constitutional government of Russia, Colonel House, then in Paris, intervened on behalf of the Bolsheviks and cabled President Wilson and the Secretary of State in the special green cipher of the State Department as follows. There has been cabled over and published here Paris statements made by American papers to the effect that Russia should be treated as an enemy. It is exceedingly important that such criticisms should be suppressed. Suppression of information critical of the Soviet Union and our military assistance to the Soviets may be traced in the State Department files from this 1917 House cable down to the present day, when export licenses issued for admittedly military equipment exports to the USSR are not available for public information. In fact, Soviet sources must be used to trace the impact of Soviet technology and Soviet military development. The Soviet Register of Shipping, for example, publishes the technical specifications of main engines in the Russian vessels, including country of manufacture. This information is not available from U.S. official sources. In November 1971, Krasnaya Zvezda published an article with special reference to the contribution of the basic Soviet industrial structure to the Soviet military power, a contribution that representatives of the U.S. executive branch have explicitly denied to the public and to Congress. Even today, U.S. assistance to the Soviet military-industrial complex and its weapon systems cannot be documented from open U.S. sources alone, because export license memorandum are classified data. Unless the technical nature of our shipment to the USSR is known, it is impossible to determine the contribution to the Soviet military complex. The national security argument is not acceptable as a defense for classification because the Soviets know what they are buying. So does the United States government. So do U.S. firms. So do the deaf, mute, blind men. The group left out in the cold is the American taxpayer voter. From time to time, bills have been introduced in Congress to make export license information freely available. These bills have never received administration support. Non-availability of current information means that decisions affecting all Americans are made by relatively few government officials without impartial outside scrutiny and under political pressure from internationalist businessmen. In many cases, these decisions would not be sustained if subjected to public examination and criticism. It is argued by policymakers that decisions affecting national security and international relations cannot be made in a goldfish bowl. The obvious answer to this is the history of the past 70 years. We have had one catastrophic international problem after another, and in the light of history, the outcome would have been far less costly if the decisions had been made in a goldfish bowl. For instance, little more than a decade after House's appeal to Wilson, Senator Smoot inquired of the State Department about the possible military end uses of an aluminum powder plant to be erected in the Soviet Union by W. Hahn, an American engineer. State Department files contain a recently declassified document which states why no reply was even given to Senator Smoot. No reply was made to Senator Smoot by the department, as the secretary did not desire to indicate that the department had no objection to the rendering by Mr. Hahn of technical assistance to the Soviet authorities in the production of aluminum powder, in view of the possibility of its use as war material, and preferred to take no position at the time in regard to the matter. Congressional action and the Freedom of Information Act and administrative claims of speedy declassification have not changed its basic situation. Major significant documents covering the history of the past 70 years are buried, and they will remain buried until an outraged public opinion puts some pressure on Congress. Congress has, on the other hand, investigated and subsequently published several reports on the exports of strategic materials to the Soviet Union. One such instance, called a Life and Death Matter by Congress, concerned the proposed shipment of ball bearing machines to the USSR. The Bryant Truck and Grinder Company accepted a Soviet order of 35 Centaligan B machines for processing miniature ball bearings. All such precision ball bearings in the United States, used by the Department of Defense for guided missile systems, were produced on 72 Bryant Centaligan Model B machines. In 1961, the Department of Commerce approved export of 35 such machines to the USSR, which would have given the Soviets capability of about equal to 50% of the U.S. capacity. The Soviets had no equipment for such production purposes, and neither the USSR nor any European manufacturer can manufacture such equipment. A Department of Commerce statement that there were other manufacturers was known to be inaccurate. Commerce proposed to give the Soviet Union an ability to use its higher thrust rockets, with much greater accuracy, and so pull ahead of the United States. Subsequently, a congressional investigation yielded accurate information not otherwise available to independent non-governmental researchers and the general public. Congressional investigations have also unearthed extraordinary errors of judgment by high officials. For example, in 1961, a dispute arose in U.S. government circles over the Transformatic case, a proposal to ship to the USSR 2 transfer lines with a total value of $4.3 million for the production of truck engines. In a statement dated February the 23rd, 1961, the Department of State went on record against shipment of the transfer lines on the grounds that the technology contained in these Transformatic machines produced in the United States is the most advanced in the world, and that so far as the department knows, the USSR has not installed this type of machinery. The receipt of this equipment by the USSR will contribute to the Soviet military economic war potential. This argument was arbitrarily overturned by the incoming Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. Secretary McNamara did not allow for the known fact that most Soviet military trucks came from 2 American-built plants, even then receiving equipment from the United States. The Transformatic machines approved by McNamara had clear and obvious military uses, as the Department of Defense had previously argued. Yet McNamara allowed them to go forward. Yet another calculated deception of the American public can be traced to the Johnson administration. In 1966, the U.S. Department of State produced a beautiful, extravagantly illustrated brochure of American hand tools. This was printed in Russian for distribution in Russia with a preface, "In Russia" by Lyndon Johnson. Requests to the State Department for a copy of this brochure went unanswered. This book is not listed in official catalogs of government publications. It is not available or even known to the general public. No printer's name appears on the back cover. The publisher is not listed. The author obtained a copy from Russia. Here is the preface. Hand Tools USA. Welcome to the Hand Tools USA exhibit, the 8th consecutive exhibit arrangement for citizens of the Soviet Union. At this exhibit, you will see the samples of various hand tools currently manufactured in the United States, tools that facilitate manual work and make it possible to produce better quality industrial goods at a much lower cost. Since the very early days of the history of our country, Americans of all ages have worked with hand tools, in industry and at home, in factories and on farms, in workshops and in schools. The hand tool has been indispensable in our lives. Some of these tools have retained their original simplicity of design. Others have acquired entirely new forms and are now used to perform new functions. We sincerely hope that this exhibit will lead to a better understanding of the American people and their way of life. Lyndon B. Johnson. Why all the secrecy? Imagine the public reaction in 1966 when the Soviets were supplying the North Vietnamese with weapons to kill Americans. Over 5,000 were killed that year. If it had become known that the State Department had published lavish booklets in Russia for free distribution in Russia at taxpayers' expense. However, the point at issue is not the wisdom of publication, but the wisdom of concealment. The public is not told because the public might protest. In other words, the public cannot be trusted to see things in the same light as the policymakers. And the policymakers are unwilling to defend their positions. Further, what would have been the domestic political consequences if it had become known that a president of the United States had signed a document in Russian, lavishly produced at the taxpayers' expense for free distribution in Russia, while Russian weapons were killing Americans in Vietnam with assistance from our deaf, mute, blind men? The citizen taxpayer does not share the expensive illusions of the Washington elite. The political reaction by the taxpayer and his fellow supporters in Congress would have been harsh and very much to the point. The deaf, mute, blind men. The key party interest in concealment of information about our export to the Soviet Union is, of course, the American firms and individuals prominently associated with such exports, the deaf, mute, blind men themselves. In general, the American public has a basic right to know what is being shipped and who is shipping it if the Soviets are using the material against us. The public also has a right to know about the personal interests of presidential appointees and previous employment with firms prominent in trade with the USSR. Until recently, the firms involved could publicly claim ignorance of the use to which the Soviets put imported Western technology. It is not a good claim, but it was made. From the 1970s on, ignorance of an end use is not a valid claim. The evidence is clear, overwhelming, and readily available. The Soviets have used American technology to kill Americans and their allies. The claim that the publication of licensed information would give undue advantage to competitors is not the kind of argument that an honest businessman would make. It is only necessary to publish certain basic elementary information, date, name of firm, amount, destination in the USSR, and a brief statement of the technical aspects. Every industry has a grapevine, and potential business in an industry is always common knowledge. In any event, suppose there was an adverse comment with a particular sale to the Soviets. Is this a bad thing? If our policies are indeed viable, why fear public opinion? Or are certain sectors of our society to be immune from public criticism? Soviet dependency on our technology and their use of this technology for military purposes could have been known to Congress on a continuing basis in the 1950s and 60s if export license information had been freely available. The problem was suspected, but the confirmation of the proof had to wait several decades until the evidence became available from Soviet sources. In the meantime, administration and business spokesmen were able to make absurd statements to Congress without fear of challenge. In general, only those who had already made up their minds that Soviet trade was desirable had access to licensed information. These were the deaf, mute, blind men, only able to see their own conception of events and blind to the fact that we had contributed to the construction of Soviet military power. In 1968, for example, the Gleason Company of Rochester, New York, shipped equipment to the Gorky automobile plant in Russia, a plant previously built by the Ford Motor Company. The information about shipment did not come from the censored licenses, but from foreign press sources. Knowledge of licensed application for any equipment to be used to Gorky would have elicited vigorous protests to Congress. Why? Because the Gorky plant produces a wide range of military vehicles and equipment. Many of the trucks used on the Ho Chi Minh Trail were gas vehicles from Gorky. The rocket launchers used against Israel are mounted on a Gas-69 chassis made at Gorky. They have a Ford-type engine made at Gorky. Thus, a screen of censorship, vigorously supported by multinational businessmen, has withheld knowledge of a secret shift in direction of U.S. foreign policy. This shift can be summarized as follows. 1. Our long-run technical assistance to the Soviet Union has built a first-order military threat to our very existence. 2. Our lengthy history of technical assistance to the Soviet military structure was known to successive administrations, but has only recently, 1982, been admitted to Congress or to the American public. 3. Current military assistance is also known, but is admitted only as a case-by-case basis when information to formulate a question can be obtained from non-government sources. 4. As a general rule, detailed data on export licenses, which are required to establish the continuing and long-run dependence of the Soviet military-industrial complex on the United States, have been made available to Congress, only by special request, and have been denied completely to the American public at large. In brief, all presidential administrations, from that of Woodrow Wilson to that of Ronald Reagan, have followed a bipartisan foreign policy of building up the Soviet Union. This policy is censored. It is a policy of suicide. Persistent pressure from non-government researchers and knowledgeable individuals has today forced the administration to at least publicly acknowledge the nature of the problem, but still do very little about it. For instance, in an interview on March 8, 1982, William Casey, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, made the following revealing statement. We have determined that the Soviet strategic advances depend on Western technology to a far greater degree than anybody ever dreamed of. It just doesn't make any sense for us to spend additional billions of dollars to protect ourselves against the capabilities that the Soviets have developed largely by virtue of having pretty much a free ride on our research and development. They use every method you can imagine: purchase, legal and illegal, theft, bribery, espionage, scientific exchange, study of trade press, and invoking the Freedom of Information Act to get this information. We find that scientific exchange is a big hole. We send scholars or young people to the Soviet Union to study Pushkin University poetry. They send a 45-year-old man out of the KGB or defense establishment to exactly the schools and professors who are working on sensitive technologies. The KGB has developed a large and dependent specialized organization which does nothing but work on getting access to Western science and technology. They have been recruiting about 100 young scientists and engineers a year for the last 15 years. They roam the world looking for technology to pick up. Back in Moscow, there are 400 or 500 assessing what they might need and where they might get it, doing their targeting, and then assessing what they get. It's a very sophisticated and far-flung operation. Unfortunately, Mr. Casey, who pleads surprise to the discovery, is still concealing the whole story. The author, not alone, made this known to the Department of Defense over 15 years ago with a request for information to develop the full nature of the problem. This exchange of letters is reproduced as Appendix A. Nothing was done in 1971. In the last 15 years, there has been a superficial change. The Reagan administration is now willing to admit the existence of the problem and has not yet been willing to face the policy challenge. Until the deaf, mute, blind men are neutralized, our assistance for Soviet strategic advances will continue. Chapter 2. American trucks in Korea and Vietnam for the other side. If we do not develop our automobile industry, we are threatened with the heaviest losses, if not defeat, in a future war. Pravda, July 20th, 1927. At the end of World War II, the U.S. government appointed an interagency committee to consider the future of German automobile industry and its war-making potential. This committee concluded that any motor vehicle industry in any country is an important factor in the country's war potential. More than half U.S. tanks, almost all armored and half-track vehicles, and one-third of guns over 33 millimeters were manufactured in U.S. civilian motor vehicle plants. Consequently, the committee unanimously recommended any vehicle industry is a major force for war. German automotive manufacturing should be prohibited because it was a war industry. Numerous military products can be made. Consequently, the committee unanimously recommended any vehicle industry as a major force for war. 2. German automotive manufacturing should be prohibited because it was a war industry. 3. Numerous military products can be made by the automobile industry, including airplanes, aerial torpedoes, aircraft cannon, aircraft instruments, aircraft engines, aircraft engine parts, aircraft ignition testers, aircraft machine guns, aircraft propeller assemblies, subassemblies, aircraft propellers, aircraft servicing and testing equipment, aircraft struts, airframes, and so on. A total of 300 items of military equipment was listed. A comparison of the recommendations from this committee with subsequent administrative recommendations and policies for the export of automobile manufacturing plants to the Soviet Union demonstrates extraordinary inconsistencies. If automobile manufacturing capacity has warlike potential for Germany and the United States, then it also has warlike potential for the Soviet Union. But the recommendations for post-war Germany and the Soviet Union are totally divergent. Some of the same Washington bureaucrats, for example, Charles R. Weaver of the Department of Commerce, participated in making both decisions. In brief, any automobile or tractor plant can be used to produce tanks, armored cars, military trucks, or other military vehicles and equipment. A major conclusion reached by a U.S. interagency committee formed to study the war-making potential of the U.S. and German automotive industries was that our motor vehicle industry has an enormous military potential. The committee recognized without dissent that Germany's motor vehicle industry was an important factor in her waging war during World War II. On the basis of its findings, the committee recommended that the manufacture of complete automobiles in Germany be prohibited, and that the manufacture of certain parts and subassemblies be specifically prohibited, and that Germany should not be permitted to retain in her possession any type of vehicles or particular military application, such as truck-laying vehicles, multi-axle vehicles, etc. The committee further listed more than 300 war products manufactured by the automotive industry. These conclusions have been ignored for the Soviet automobile industry, even while the Soviets themselves officially stated their intention to use foreign automobile technology for military vehicles as early as 1927. V.V. Osinski, top planner, wrote a series of articles for Pravda, July 20th, 21st, and 27th, 1927, with the following warning. If in a future war we use the Russian peasant cart against the American or European automobile, the result, to say the least, will be disproportionately heavy losses, the inevitable consequences of technical weakness. This is certainly not industrialized defense. The Soviet military civilian vehicle manufacturing industry, as subsequently developed, produces a limited range of utilitarian trucks and automobiles in a few large plants designed, built by, and almost entirely equipped with Western, primarily American, technical assistance and machinery. These motor vehicle plants mostly manufacture their own components and ship these to assembly plants elsewhere in the Soviet Union. There is a high degree of integration between Russian military and civilian vehicle models. Military and civilian vehicles have interchangeable parts, and Soviet policy is to maximize unification of military and civilian designs to assist model changeover in case of war. This unification of military and civilian automobile design has been described by the Soviet economist A.N. Lagovsky. The fewer design changes between the old and the new type of product, the easier and more rapidly the enterprise will shift to new production. If, for example, a chassis, motor, and other parts of a motor vehicle of a civilian model are used for a military motor vehicle, of course, the shift to the mass production of the military motor vehicle will occur considerably faster and more easily than if design of all the main parts were different. Lagovsky notes that Soviet civilian agricultural tractors and military vehicles can be used directly as military vehicles without major conversion. The Soviet tractors, direct copies of Caterpillar models, were used as artillery tractors in World War II in Korea. General G.I. Pokrovsky makes a similar argument about the U.S. 106mm recoilless weapon mounted on Willys Jeep and comments that even relatively powerful recoilless artillery systems can at the present time be mounted on light automobile without reducing the number of men accommodated. Almost all, possibly 95% of the Soviet military vehicles are produced in very large plants designed by American engineers in the 1930s through the 1970s. The Soviet military truck industry. Soviet civilian and military trucks are produced in the same plants and have extensive interchangeability of parts and components. For example, the ZIL-131 with the main 1.5-ton 6x6 military truck used in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and is produced also in a civilian 4x2 version as the ZIL-130. After 60% of the parts in the ZIL-131 military truck are common to the ZIL-130 civilian truck. All Soviet truck technology and a large part of Soviet truck manufacturing equipment has come from the West, mainly from the United States. While some elementary transfer lines and individual machines for vehicles produced or made in the Soviet Union, these are copies of Western machines and always obsolete in design. Many major American companies have been prominent in building up the Soviet truck industry. The Ford Motor Company, the A.J. Brandt Company, the Austin Company, General Electric, Swindler Dreiser, and many others supply the technical assistance, design, work, and equipment of the original giant plants. This Soviet military civilian truck industry originally comprised two main groups of plants, plus 5 newer giant plants. The first group used models, technical assistance, and parts and components from the Ford-built Gorky automobile plant. GAZ is the model designation. The second group of production plants used models, parts, and components from the A.J. Brandt rebuilt ZIL plant in Moscow. Consequently, this plant was called the BBH ZIL plant after the 3 companies involved in the construction and expansion of the 1930s, A.J. Brandt, Budd, and Hamilton Foundry. This is a fundamental difference between the Ford and Brandt companies. Brandt had only one contract in the USSR to rebuild the old AMO plant in 1929, and AMO in 1930 had a production of 30,000 trucks per year, compared to the Gorky plant, designed from scratch by Ford for an output of 140,000 vehicles per year. Ford is still interested in Russian business. Brandt is not interested and has not been seen since 1930. The Ford Gorky group of assembly plants includes the plants at Ulyanskov, model design UAS, Odessa, model design OAS, and Pavlovo, model designation PAZ. The BBHZIL group includes the truck plants of Michisky, MMZ, model designation, Mias, Uralziz, Nepratovic, model design DAZ, Kutaisi, Kaz model, and Lvov, LAZ model. Besides these main groups, there are also 5 independent plants. The Minsk truck plant, MAZ, was built with German assistance. The Hercules Ladislav truck plant, YAAZ, was built by the Hercules Motor Company. The MZMA plant in Moscow, which manufactures small automobiles, was also built by the Ford Motor Company. In the late 1960s came the so-called Fiat Tagliati auto plant. 3/4 of this equipment came from the United States. Then in 1972, the U.S. government issued $1 billion in licenses to export equipment and technical assistance for the Kama truck plant. Planned as the largest truck plant in the world, it covers 36 square miles and produces more heavy trucks, including military trucks, than the output of all U.S. heavy truck manufacturers combined. Taglati and Kama are described in Chapter 3 below. This comprises the complete Soviet vehicle manufacturing industry, all built with Western, primarily American, technical assistance and technology. Military models are produced in these plants utilizing the same components of these civilian models. The 2 main vehicle centers, Gorky and ZIL, manufacture more than 2/3 of all Soviet civilian vehicles, excluding the new Taglati and Kama plants, and almost all current military vehicles. Okay, that is all we have for tonight, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. It's Tyler Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.